morning.
How are we all today? Here on a gorgeous day. So my name is Rebekah Smith. I'm a park ranger here at Fort Raleigh. I have been here a grand total of 2 months and 5 days. So this is a story that I am still learning myself, but I'm going to do the best I can to teach you what I know about the lesser known Roanoke Island colony. This here is Jess. Jess is with Outer Banks Forever, one of our friend organizations. She is going to be filming me as part of the upcoming Juneteenth celebration. Do you all know what Juneteenth is?
New federal holiday.
It is now a federal holiday. Yes. And we will talk a little bit about that towards the end of my program. You guys are more than welcome to come a little closer if you'd like. But before we get started, gotta do a little safety talk real quick. We know that a lot of people come to our park, also go to the seashore, so we gotta do a quick rip current safety test. Do you all know what rip currents are? How do you spot them? Don't know? Flat water in between the waves. Flat water that is full of sediment and it's foamy because of all the dirt and sand underwater that's being lifted up. So if you get caught in a rip current, how do you get yourself out of it? Swim parallel to the shore. What happens if you swim against the current? You tire yourself out, exhaust yourself out. That's how you drown. What is option B if you cannot swim yourself parallel to the shore? Float. It's not the type of current that will drag you underwater. Just keep your head above the water, relax, don't panic, and it will take you out to the sea, but the current will stop, and it will drop you off, and then it'll be safe for you to swim yourself at an angle back to the shore. So there are 4 lifeguarded beaches on the seashore. They have a flag system. If there's a red flag up on the beach, should you go in the water? No. If you go to an unlifeguarded beach, how are you going to recognize what the rip current conditions are? What was that?
By the waves.
By the waves. So if you know how to spot them yourself, that's perfect. But if you don't, you can also sign up for what's called OBX alerts. You get 3 text messages every morning that will tell you to check the weather and tell you what the rip current conditions for the day are at all of the seashore beaches. And then unsubscribe from them when you leave, because they will keep coming and they're kind of annoying. So, is this anybody's first time at Fort Raleigh? Just curious, anybody's first time in the Outer Banks? When you all came to Fort Raleigh, did you realize Roanoke Island was part of the Underground Railroad network to freedom?
Yeah.
You did?
I read it on the website.
See, there you go. Planning, preparing ahead of time. But I bet you all are at least a little familiar with the story of the Lost Colony, weren't you? But not of the Freedmans Colony that was here. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, slavery. Yay! So getting this out of the way, knocking it out of the park, what was the Civil War about?
Slavery.
We have a fundamental economic difference between the northern states and the southern states. The north, all about factory, industry. The south, large-scale farming, dependent on slave labor. So as the United States is expanding, we're getting new states westward. There is conflict over whether these states should be free or slaveholding. Eventually, we get our 11 states that secede and form the Confederate States of America. The Civil War begins March 1861. It takes a full year for the Civil War to reach Roanoke Island. But in February 1862, we have the Battle of Roanoke Island. Now, the Union has already taken over Hatteras Island down south, and they have their sights set on Roanoke Island. Now, thanks to information from 2 very brave slaves that row from here down to Hatteras, the Union knows that there are 2,500 Confederate troops here, that they have about 3 sand forts, and basically they're just not well defended. So the Union, with this information, they're going to bring 11,000 troops to Roanoke Island. How long do you think the Battle of Roanoke Island lasted? Lasted a grand total of a day before the Confederates realized they're outmanned and they surrender. Now, in the hands of the Union, there are 200 slaves here on Roanoke Island. Now, they're not from here. They were brought here from other plantations in eastern North Carolina to build defenses for the Confederates. And now the Union has to figure out what they're going to do with these 200 slaves. Using what's called the Confiscation Acts, there were two of them in 1861 and 1862, they used the South's language against them. These acts refer to the enslaved as property, but they can be confiscated in the spoils of war. So now that property belongs to the Union, and they can do whatever they want with it. It, of course, being people. So they are labeled contrabands of war. And they have two choices. Stay here on Roanoke Island with their newly granted freedom, or return to eastern North Carolina to their families. How many do you think stay? Do you think most people stay? Or that most people leave? 27 of the 200 stay. 173 go back to eastern North Carolina, because what did they leave in eastern North Carolina? Families. These were able-bodied men here building forces for the Confederates, and they left their wives and their children behind. So for them, this is an easy decision. But eastern North Carolina, still under control of the Confederacy. They are leaving their free status here on Roanoke Island to go back to the part of the country where they will have that slave label thrown back on them. So what happens if they're caught? Go back into slavery, be punished, perhaps killed, but it's worth it. Worth it to be reunited with their friends and their families and their children, and try and come back here and make a life as a unified family. As they're going, spreading across eastern North Carolina, going to their plantations, they're spreading the word. As this first light of freedom marker says, if you can cross the creek to Roanoke Island, you will find safe haven. This is how we get our connection to the Underground Railroad. All of these people spreading the word of the safe haven here. The creek that they're talking about is Croatan Sound to the west. It was not a sound at that time, it was a marshland. So it's still not an easy journey, but at least they didn't have to swim all the way over here. So we started out February of 1862 with 200 enslaved African Americans on Roanoke Island. Once this word of the safe haven spreads, by the end of the year we now have 1,000. 1,000 African Americans who have made their way here. Now, do they know the life that awaits them on Roanoke Island? No. All they know is it must be better than the plantation that they just came from. So, they're finding shelter wherever they can. There's no formal, established, organized colony at this point. They are taking shelter in old rebel barracks. This is, for all intents and purposes, a refugee camp at this point. The Union has not stepped in yet. They're just going where they can. But the Union's getting a little worried, because now you have 1,000 people cramped on the north end of this island, possible sanitary issues, and they are going to step in. And in April 1863, we have our official formation of the Freedmans College. The Reverend Horace James, given the worst job title ever, superintendent of all the blacks, is in charge of Freedman's colony. to form an organized, independent, self-sustaining, free community for our newly freed, formerly enslaved African Americans. So they are each given a plot of land. For our new African Americans that make it here, their name is taken, their enslaver's name is taken, the plantation from which they came is noted, and they are given the promise: we will not send you back to your plantation. This is the safe haven, and you do not have to worry about being labeled a fugitive slave. This is your home now. The first two buildings our newly freed African Americans built when they first got here were a church and a school. When we have our 1,000 here now, they build upon that. More schools, more churches. American Missionary Association sends down white missionaries from the north to teach our African Americans, our freedmen, how to read, how to write, math skills, trade skills, everything that they would need for a life after slavery. So at this point, it is illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. So most of these people are seeing letters and numbers for the first time in their lives. At this point in North Carolina, it is illegal for black men to preach. But they have their own churches now, and they can worship as they please. What are they doing for jobs at this point? What do you think? What can you do here on the island to make money? Farm. As our lost colony learned a few hundred years before, Roanoke Island doesn't have the most fertile soil. It's not the best place for farming. But initially, our able-bodied black men are working as cooks, longshoremen, blacksmiths, woodcutters, etc. for the Union. Our women, cooking, cleaning, seamstresses, etc. Our men are making $10 a month. This novel concept, being paid for your work. Our women, about $4 a month. And everybody gets a ration, which was, every month, 10 ounces of pork or bacon, or 1 pound of fresh beef, plus a pound of cornmeal 5 times a week, plus 1 pound of flour, or 12 ounces of hard bread twice a week, mixed in with salt, soap, stuff like that. Eventually, 1863, the Union allows black men to enlist in the Union Army. That means all of our able-bodied men are now off in other parts of North Carolina, not in the colony. How is the colony going to sustain itself without the men working here? They need help. Government assistance. These rations are important, and this money that they're making is what's going to help sustain this colony. So Horace James, our superintendent of Negro affairs, whatever you want to call him, he gets a sawmill. He believes sawmill and shad fisheries will be the key, the income necessary to help keep this colony independent and self-sustaining. So what happens with our sawmill? It's going great for a little while. Eventually, they run out of timber, run out of wood. For our shad fisheries, they don't realize, but during the winter, the sound freezes. And they have trouble getting nets. So we have, for the first time in North Carolina, the first Freedman's colony. But it's not all that it seems, all that it should be. It has some issues. So by 1865, we now have our peak, 3,500 formerly enslaved African Americans making their home here on Roanoke Island. But as we just discussed, everything was not as it seemed. I have a letter here from William Benson and Richard Etheridge. Is the name Richard Etheridge familiar to anybody? No. Richard Etheridge was born a slave on Roanoke Island, but he is known for being the last keeper of the Pea Island life-saving station. He was the first black keeper in the U.S. life-saving station service. And he had an all-black crew at Pea Island life-saving station. He was part of this colony, and in 1865 he wrote this letter to the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established to prepare our formerly enslaved for a life after slavery. He has 4 main complaints. The first, when we were enlisted in the service, we were promised that our wives and families should receive rations from the government. The rations for our wives and family have been cut down to 1/2 the regular ration. Consequently, 3 or 4 days out of every 10 days, we have nothing to eat. So they were promised food, and that food has now been cut down in half. His second complaint, Mr. Holland Streeter, your assistant superintendent of all the blacks, is no part of an abolitionist. He takes no care of the colored people and has no sympathy with the colored people. So Holland Streeter, your assistant superintendent of all the blacks, and Horace James, your superintendent of all the blacks, believed in what they say was the political equality of black people. They should own land, they should own the products of their labor, but they didn't believe in the social equality of the black people. We should be integrating them into society, but there is a social stratification, and black people are on the bottom of that ladder. And these are the people in charge of your free, self-sustaining, independent community, and they don't even believe fully in your equality. The third, the cause of much suffering is that Captain James has not paid the colored people for their work for near a year. Our men who had gone into the army have not been paid the last 8 to 10 months. And on top of that, their rations are being cut in half. The fourth, our families have no protection. The white soldiers break into our houses, act as they please, steal our chickens, rob our gardens, and if anyone defends themselves against them, they are taken to the guardhouse for it. This is supposed to be their community, a community that they called California, the community of their dreams. And they have no protection for their families. The promises that were made, the food, the jobs, the money, those promises have not been fulfilled. What also happens in 1865? The end of the war. The war is over. When the Union first established the Freedmans Colony, they confiscated 1,100 acres of land. And now guess who wants that land back? The landowners whose land it was taken from. They want their land back. They petitioned the president at the time, Andrew Johnson, to have their land returned to them. They have to prove 2 things. Number 1, that they have a land title, that this is in fact their land. Number 2, swear an oath of allegiance to the United States of America. Make sure that Confederate rebel business is behind them and that they're all about the new United States of America. So once those 2 things are fulfilled, they get their land back. So now what happens to our freedmen? Kicked out of here. They gotta go. By 1866, our population, which at its height a year before was 3,500, has now been cut in half. The writing was on the wall. They knew that they were going to have to leave. They returned to eastern North Carolina, where they came from, to try and replicate the same independent, free community. By 1867, the colony is officially decommissioned. Now, we had gone from 3,500 in 1865. 1870, we now have 300 African Americans living on Roanoke Island. Would you call the colony a failure? Why not?
Maybe with the model for what it could be.
First time in their lives, they're getting this taste of independence. They're getting an education. They're allowed to worship the way that they want to, even though it was for a short amount of time, something they had still never experienced before. And now they can take those lessons to their new places where they're going to try and replicate the same experiences. 11 families, though, they had made Roanoke Island their home. They did not want to leave. 11 families banded together to buy 242 acres from a white landowner in the area, the Doe family, who, just by coincidence, is also the same family that the Park Service bought this land from. The community of California still exists today. 300 African Americans, 1870, still have descendants living on this island to this day. A legacy that still stands 160 whatever years later. I want you all to just take a minute, talk to the person next to you. I'm going to ask you this question. What does freedom look like to you? What does freedom look like to you? And then ask yourselves, if even for just a moment in time, our freedmen had what you're thinking about. Now, on Saturday, June 19th, our new federal holiday, Juneteenth, is upon us. Now, our enslaved here on Roanoke Island were granted their freedom February of 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed January 1st, 1863, but it only granted freedom to the enslaved in Confederate territories. If you're the Confederacy, slave owners in the Confederacy, are you going to tell your enslaved that this proclamation has just been signed granting your freedom? No. Many enslavers hid this information from their enslaved. So June 19th, 1865, is when the last Union troops rode into Galveston, Texas with the good news. You are free. And that is what Juneteenth commemorates. The end of slavery in the United States is what Juneteenth is all about. So that is why we have our dear friend Jess here. Outer Banks Forever. It's part of their celebration of Juneteenth. So our freedmen here on Roanoke Island, they were part of the lucky ones. Other people across the South had to wait a little bit longer. So I thank you all for hanging out with me today, listening to this story. There's a lot more to it. You can read more about it yourselves, but please, next time you come here, don't forget about the other Roanoke Island colony. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any more questions, I'll be around here or in the visitor center. But thank you all very much.